favourite organisations. In fact, it's much older than 50 years. You've heard me talk many times about Thomas Coram and the Foundling Hospital in sort of around Russell Square, which subsequently became the Foundling Museum, and about Jacqueline Wilson and her brilliant Hetty Feather stories. And I was very proud to go along last night and help them celebrate this big anniversary. 1739, I think, or certainly nearly 300 years of experience in this field, but 50 years being commemorated last night as an adoption agency. I speak of Coram Adoption. We'll speak in a bit to one of the mums who has benefited from the work that Coram do. But before that, we'll talk to Dr. Carol Homden, who is CEO of Coram and who gave a lovely speech last night about the work that the organisation does. One of the things that we touched on last night, Carol, was how much adoption itself has changed in the 50 years that Coram has been in existence. Coram Adoption has been in existence, and of course 50 years since I myself was adopted. What are I hesitate to use the word typical, but what are the sort of common factors that you find in children who you seek to place these days? It's not the sort of relatively newborn babies being given up by mothers who can't keep them for social or religious reasons, is it? It's a very different picture.
Good morning, James. No, you're absolutely right. All the work that Coram Adoption does is a service to children who have had the toughest possible start in life. Those children who, because of the profound challenges and circumstances of their early years at home, are not able to remain with those families. And the court has decided that they need a new, loving, adoptive family. And it's to that work that we are dedicated. Some of the drivers of those challenges, of course, compounded by pressures of social attitude still, but also by poverty, are, I'm afraid, the continuing challenges of drugs, alcohol, and drugs, alcohol, and violence. It's less to do with other lifestyle issues. So the children have had a tough start in life, and they need the loving home and stability that adoptive parents can bring them.
And what sort of reservations do you find potential adoptive parents have? What are the sort of the myths that you're most committed to exploding when people express an interest in adopting, but just need a little bit of help getting to the next levels, the next stages?
Yeah, well, adopters coming forwards are ordinary people who do this most extraordinary thing. But very often there is a journey to go on of understanding some of the challenges that the children who are available for adoption from the care system will have faced, and what that actually may mean for the parenting that you need to show to those children. There are also the other things. I mean, adopters are worried that perhaps they won't find the child that's right for them, or they're concerned about whether they will have the support that they might need, depending on what challenges they face. At the moment, of course, we are concerned that also adopters may be worried about financial circumstances or having enough room in their homes as well as in their hearts. And that's what organisations like Coram, a leading voluntary adoption agency, are there for, which is to walk by the side of people who think that they may be able to do this wonderful thing for children and for themselves and their family, and to help them to achieve it.
And that help, of course, another big difference from my day, as it were, from people who were adopted 40, 50 or more years ago, is the lifelong support that Coram has been very pioneering in support for adoptive families way beyond the handover.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, the moment a child moves in is the start of the journey, not the end. It might be the end of becoming an adopter and the start of becoming a parent and an adoptive family. So the kinds of support that Coram has pioneered includes particular parenting groups. For example, we know that all children will present different challenges as they become teenagers. And so we proactively offer parenting group support to our adopters to make sure that they're ready for that. Children are understandably going to ask questions about who they are, where they come from. And in a digital era, we need to support them to manage the risks of that exploration. So those are some of the ways in which we would support them. And of course, for some children, there may be a need for more intensive support or therapy.
And finally, the research that's been undertaken very recently shows that even though, and it's good that you make the point that almost all teenagers are going to have wibbles and wobbles with regards to their family and even their identity. But one of the things I learned last night that delighted me, actually, because I have godchildren who are adopted from the sort of backgrounds that Quorum works with, is that the research suggests that even however difficult the teens may be, as with unadopted children, the periods of readjustment and reconciliation, and people are generally a lot happier in their 20s, even if they had a really tough teenage time.
Yes, that's right. One of the things Quorum does is to follow up with adoptive families and to provide the evidence back, really, of the lifetime of difference that adoption makes. And you are quite right, James. All children will have some times when they need help at school or in exploring who they are. But the love and support that an adoptive family gives to these children does make a lifetime of difference. And adoption is remarkably effective and successful for the children that it serves, as well as bringing a great deal of joy to all the families that welcome those children.
Carol Homden, the CEO, Dr. Carol Homden, the CEO of Quorum, thank you. I'll tell people how they can find out more, or even get in touch with Quorum Adoption shortly. But before that, I want to speak to Rebecca, who is a single parent of two adopted sons, aged 4 and 1. And Rebecca, you went through the early permanence placement, which, again, I only really learnt about last night. And that is one of Quorum's initiatives that it places a baby or a young child under 2 with a foster carer who has hopes of adopting, but you have that little period where the courts are going to decide whether the baby can be cared for permanently by the birth family or not. I wonder if you can tell me what that's like, because you're going to have that fear in the back of your mind as you bond with the baby and you bond with the child that the courts may decide that the baby doesn't stay with you.
Yes, that's right. But I think it's morally good that the courts prioritise birth families if that's at all possible. For me, the uncertainty was that I was told that if the baby did return to birth family, I'd have to take a break and then wait for another placement and then go through the process again. Yes. And I'd wanted to adopt for many years, and I didn't really want to have another maybe 1 or 2 years to wait. So that was what I had to deal with. But I knew that before I got into it. So that's just one of those things I accepted.
It is, isn't it? I was surprised and delighted to read that you always knew that you wanted to have a family through adoption. Why do you think that was?
I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's because my parents were foster carers. Yeah. Maybe I was quite young when the images out of Romania came in the Romanian orphanages.
Yes.
So maybe that had an impact as well. But yeah, I'd always planned to have my family through adoption. And then I got into my 20s and I thought, if I don't put a plan into place, this is never going to happen. So I tried to get things sorted and I was ready to adopt. What
difference does Quorum make? What difference did Quorum make? And what do they do perhaps differently from other agencies or other organisations?
Well, I was a foster carer before I applied to adopt. And I wasn't able to adopt through the local authority I was fostering with. So I think what I appreciated about Quorum was they took time to listen to the circumstances and to consider me for adoption. So that's what I valued about Quorum. And they do have great support post-adoption as well. So I took the children to a stay and play. So they spend time with other adopted children and foster children as well. So that was great.
And what sort of, aftercare do you do? I mean, with regards to the birth family and contact and things like that, if you don't mind me asking.
Yeah, so when I was a foster carer, I took the children to contact sessions, which is a supervised session with the birth family. And that was actually really good because I got to know the birth family and I can share that information with my children as they get older. So that's what I did before. And then most adoptive placements have what's called letterbox contacts. So you might write a letter once a year to different birth family members just to let them know what's going on with the child, and then they can write to you.
So you know where you are. The children know where they are, but also where they came from. It's changed a lot. I was adopted 50 years ago this year, and it's changed a lot, hasn't it? I love the way it evolves, Rebecca, the way that organisations like Quorum are constantly trying to improve and enhance the services that they can provide, rather than just sort of thinking, oh, we've got something that works, let's just leave it now and stop trying to enhance and improve things.
Yeah, it has. Yeah, it's good. You can. It's very research led. It appears.
Yes, exactly.
So I think that's useful, because then we can all learn what's best for the children who need our help the most.
Which is, of course, what matters most. Rebecca, thank you so much. You can find out more about Quorum Adoption at quorumadoption.org.uk, and Quorum is spelled CORAM. Quorumadoption.org.uk. It's 12 noon. And it's 3 minutes after 12. A change of pace, a breather. When is the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about the skip fire of Liz Truss's premiership? I'm going back. I was in Birmingham on Friday, wasn't I? Did we do 3 hours on I can't remember. But the story that broke while we were on air that struck me as something we probably would have talked about if the political landscape wasn't so utterly compelling and urgent and important. Hard to talk about anything else at the moment. I said to you, didn't I, a few times, imagine if I'd told you that Brexit was a good idea, or I'd been one of the people that tickled Boris Johnson's tummy on a regular basis, or thought that the Liz Truss mini budget was the best what would we actually be talking about at the moment? I genuinely have no idea at all. But one thing that I would have spoken about in normal circumstances was the protesters who threw soup at Van Gogh sunflowers. I'm pretty sure that it was covered in glass, so one has to hope that no permanent damage has been done to the Van Gogh picture of sunflowers, which seems to me a relatively blameless phenomenon in the context of fossil fuel exploitation and environmental issues in general. So that's number one, Van Gogh sunflowers. Number two is the milk protests. Have you seen the milk protests, where people go into a supermarket and start emptying milk all over the place? That's different from Stop Oil, is it? That's farming, that's animal rights sort of thing. Down with down with like veganism, I guess. So that's number two. And then you've got people who, I think, climbed up a bridge, didn't they? On the Queen Elizabeth II bridge at Dartford Crossing. I fully appreciate that if you're listening to this in Aberdeen or in Ancoats, or I have to come up with lots of places that begin with A now. I should have chosen a better letter, shouldn't I? Aberdeen or Ancoats or Arbroath. So it's a bit Scotland heavy at the moment. Or Aldershot. Actually, no, Aldershot isn't quite near Kent or in Kent. Oh, let me start again. If you're listening to this in Birmingham or Burnley or Bolton or Bridgend or Bognor Regis or Batley. Not Bromley, Keith. Bromley's in Kent, mate. I'm talking. It's like places that are miles away from Kent. That I'm talking. I've lost my thread now. Bewdley. That'll do. I appreciate that the story about a bridge in Kent closing is not actually the thing that has been keeping you energised or exercised over the course, ever, frankly. But a couple of people climbed up a bridge including, one of them was a bridge design engineer. I don't know why I find that relevant, but I do. They climbed up the Queen Elizabeth II bridge at the Dartford crossing and caused traffic to come to a standstill. This is the Just Stop Oil protests, which people started throwing fireworks at them. Fireworks have been blasted at protesters, causing travel chaos. I'll tell you now, we're going to have not a light-hearted approach to this story, but one of the reasons why I worry about stories like this is because I think some corners of the media engender so much negativity. They're probably partly responsible for some idiot deciding to try and fire fireworks at someone who's 250 feet in the air. You can imagine what the worst consequences of that would be, and the horribleness. I fully appreciate the inconvenience of being stuck in traffic on your way to work, and I understand why claiming that ambulances can't get through is so powerful. These people must have been absolutely livid about the Queen's funeral, mustn't they? The people who think that a road protest for a couple of hours blocking up ambulances is going to cause untold casualties and deaths. The Queen's funeral must have sent them absolutely potty. And the entire city, most of the country was brought to a complete standstill. You couldn't even get up the A4, the main road to Heathrow. I mean, goodness knows how these people who profess fury about road protests dealt with the fact or the disruption caused by Her Majesty's funeral. I'm comfortable up to a point with both. But there's going to be some horror. This isn't going to stop, this Just Stop Oil protests. And some corners of the right-wing media are so close to almost encouraging violence. You see it on our website, sadly. And someone grabs someone and drags them out of the road, you get a lot of congratulations or suggestions that people should have gone further or that they should have... stop sending me places that begin with B now, all right? I've got plenty, okay? Thank you. Balmoral to keep the royal theme going. Bathgate, Bristol. All right, I said stop sending them. Honestly, I can't. Bridgend, Anglesey. No, you've gone back to the A's now. Andover, Aberystwyth. My inbox is not my own. So the Just Stop Oil people and the milk people, and we've got. Was there another one? Was the Van Gogh people were Just Stop Oil people? I think, weren't they? That was Just Stop Oil. So it's a conversation really about protest, and then you've got the people that glue themselves to the road. And I have two thoughts at times like this. The first one I've just shared with you. The first one is, if you're going to cover this, cover it responsibly. Don't do anything that could be construed as encouraging people to hate the protesters, because if they hate them today, they shoot fireworks at them tomorrow. I don't know if you're aware of that story. Fireworks have been blasted at eco-protesters, causing travel chaos. Footage shared on social media shows fireworks being launched in the direction of protesters on the QE2 bridge on Monday evening. That's my first thought, is please cover it responsibly. So if you're in the mood to ring up and start screaming, I'm probably not going to take your call. If you've got something sensible to say, I'd love to talk to you. And the second thought I have is the curious circularity of this. So I suppose the stupidest thing you could say about protests was, I don't mind them as long as nobody notices them or as long as they don't disrupt anything. And you think, okay, that's great then. So I'll just stand here waving my flag, shall I, and get completely ignored by everybody. And then they say, well, I don't mind as long as it's peaceful. So then they do a peaceful protest. And it turns out all the people who said that they don't mind as long as it's peaceful actually mind just as much when it is peaceful. There's a hypocrisy that I think is born of guilt. I have the guilt, but I don't have the hypocrisy. I know that most of these people are right. I'm not so sure about the milk stuff. But when it comes to the oil stuff, obviously they're right. Obviously. This is just the craziest period of human history where we continue to pump poison into our atmosphere and pump money into the pockets of some of the richest people in the world solely because there has been no effort whatsoever or very, very little effort put into alternatives. Having said that, if I was stuck on a bridge, if I was stuck in traffic for a day and a half, they've been up there for 2 days now, not 2 hours, forgive me. My inconvenience, my confusion, my rage, whatever you would call it, would be considerable. But that's where the circularity comes in. Because what you need to understand about these people, maybe not all of them, but certainly most of them, what you need to understand is that they correctly, and I'm going to use an analogy now, they are pointing out that the building we all inhabit is on fire, and they can't understand why you and me are sitting downstairs watching television, instead of trying to A, put the fire out, and B, start rebuilding the bits that have burnt down. That is it. It is that simple. We're sitting downstairs watching the One Show, you and me. Even if we're sitting there going, oh, I actually approve of those fellas up on the roof, trying to put out the fire and replace some of the tiles that have burnt. They're doing good work. I know it's annoying a lot of people, but I really approve of what they're doing. But I'm still sitting downstairs watching television. I kind of don't know what the answer to this question is. I know what the answer isn't. Oh, let's all just be angry and ignorant about it. That is in many ways what the tabloid newspaper model of reporting does. But what would you do if it was your house on fire? And for reasons you don't understand, members of your family were sitting downstairs watching telly while you're screaming at them to get the hell out, help extinguish the flames, and start doing something about fixing the damage. That's all it is. It's not particularly complicated. The guilt comes from the knowledge that they're right. The hypocrisy comes from pretending that they're not, or pretending that they could somehow protest in a way that didn't get noticed. That's the maddest thing. Imagine if the suffragettes had done that. women still wouldn't have the vote. What are you doing today, Mum? Oh, I'm just going out. I'm just going to out sign a petition. I'm just going to go out and well, actually, I'm not allowed to do that anymore since Priti Patel changed the law. I'm just going to write some letters. I'm going to write some letters to the MPs about the environment, about oil. It doesn't work. The only Gandhi. These people, without realising it, they're so stupid. They're disapproving of Gandhi, essentially. Oh no, I don't like the protests when they actually disrupt things. I like the ones that nobody ever notices. So whatever changes. Probably still have slavery, still be sending kids up chimneys. Women wouldn't have the vote. India would still be part of the British Empire. I suppose they'd like that bit, wouldn't they, some of them? So that's the question. And I don't mean light-hearted, necessarily. I mean psychological. I'd like to examine the psychology of it. So we've got 3 examples there. Let's stick in 4 when you just glue yourself to a road. And I'm a little bit confused why I react differently to all of them. So I felt when I saw the soup being thrown at the sunflowers, I felt that they were very silly people. I felt that they were very wrong. And then I thought about it and I thought, well, they've got noticed and they've raised awareness. Maybe they were right. And then you hear lots of people saying, well, they've turned me right off. And that's when you think, really? So you were a committed anti-fossil fuel activist, were you, up until the moment they threw soup at a Van Gogh painting, and now you've decided not to be bothered about fossil fuels at all? That just seems to me to be very silly. 0345 60973 is the number. And then the milk protests, which I just felt were, wrong in the sense that drinking milk is not as obviously damaging or as obviously wrong as our continuing dependence on fossil fuels. Then you got the people up the bridge who are disrupting traffic, or the people gluing themselves to roads who are disrupting traffic. And I'm not saying that I don't know what to think about it all, but what I want to know is, why do some of these protests alienate us while some of them inspire us? 0345 60973. Can we unpick it? And I don't want to sound rude, but there are loads of opportunities to say stupid things about issues like this all over phone-in radio in the United Kingdom. You everywhere, millions of opportunities just to be a bit ignorant and a bit pig-headed. This is not one of those spaces. It's not one of those places. Or at least it doesn't set out to be. Some of it works. Some of it doesn't. How do you know the difference? And if you think it's worth it, that people might be susceptible to a little bit of intelligent explanation, then tell me why you actually approve of the protest, particularly in the context of just stop oil, regardless of the disruption it causes. Because look, I could come on the radio and say to you, oh, aren't they awful? We should bring back the birch or something like that, or lock them up and throw away the key. And a certain type of punter would be delighted with that, and they'd make jokes about how they'd like to beat them up or something like that. And yet the planet is dying. It's the very definition of short-termism. And the reason I sound confused and a bit conflicted on stuff like this is that I get it. I get both. I don't get the violence or the unpleasantness to people who are acting in what they think are the best interests of the whole species. But I get the ennui. Not the former Arsenal player. French word for boredom. I get the well, I can't do it. And I used to get the hypocrisy, particularly with vegetarianism and veganism, as you may remember. I used to be one of those very silly people who knew that they were right. And I know it's wrong to eat flesh, to eat meat. I still haven't given it up. I cut down enormously. I know that it's wrong, and because you make me feel bad, I'm going to attack you. How much of it is that? I know these protesters are right, but because they make you feel bad, you're going to attack them. And I suppose the more of a petrol head you are, the more of a hypocrite you're likely to become. So as someone who does 95% of his travel by public transport, I'm pretty golden on this one, but not, of course, on the milk protest. I'll tell you straight, I still find there's something ridiculous about emptying all the milk bottles in a supermarket. I just find that ridiculous. But I probably would have found the Stop Oil protest ridiculous once. And that's why I'm fascinated in the tactics that work and the tactics that don't. Just give me a ring. Let's chat about this. You don't have to have a particularly pungent opinion or a particularly coruscating insight, because if I've proved anything in the last 18 minutes, it's that I don't. It's 21 minutes after 12. The question I always want to ask, but no one's ever been able to answer it, so I've stopped asking it. It's too sort of complicated, is what would work? What would persuade you to take more action against, for example, fossil fuel usage? Because I know what people don't like any protest that inconveniences you at all, but you're never going to notice it if it doesn't inconvenience you. So what would you do instead? What would actually work? Phone lines are full at the moment, but I doubt everybody's going to be coming on air. So let's free a few up. And what would actually work? I like this from Ben. James, I will continue to say this until it is reality. If some people find a few protests inconvenient, a 1 metre rise in sea level will render most capital cities worldwide, together with miles of coastal areas, uninhabitable. Now, how inconvenient would that be? And that's part of my problem as well. I get that, I understand it, and I know that you're right. But I don't feel it as keenly or as urgently as you do, Ben. And I sometimes wish that I did. Professionally, I can't. I know that sounds weird, but I can't talk about this every day for 3 hours every day, even though if you were to make an objective algorithm of stuff that matters, it would probably suggest that we did. Maybe not Mystery Hour, 14 hours a week of this plus Mystery Hour. But the people who do feel it keenly will risk their lives climbing bridges, will risk abuse and attack by gluing themselves to roads, will risk media pylons, because the balance of what matters and what doesn't matter is so complete. I don't care what you call me. I don't care how vile you are to me. I don't care what you think of me for throwing soup at the sunflowers. If it has changed 10 minds, 5 minds, 1 mind, if one more person now understands the threat of environmental catastrophe, then it was worth doing. I get that completely. Intellectually, but not emotionally. It's a weird one. Kath's in Bingley, which begins with B. Kath, what would you like to say?
Hello. I think it affects people differently depending on if it's actually made a mess of your day, so to speak.
Yes.
You know, if folks shinnying up bridges means you're stuck in traffic and you've got to get somewhere urgently, you are going to be so annoyed, shall we say.
But there'll be people in Bingley who are annoyed by this if they've had their buttons pressed in the right way by sort of newspapers.
Yeah, you will always annoy somebody.
Tell me about it.
No matter what you do.
It's a living. It's a living, Kath. I do my best.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So the people that might end up being more supportive of it are the people whose attention has been drawn to it, but whose days haven't been disrupted by it.
Yeah, they might just, if it's not really impacted them that day, well, they may just think about it a bit more. But when that cloud of red mist comes down because you're sitting in traffic, you're not going to see anything else but that red mist.
Well, you say that, and I don't know if I'll be able to tell you this without getting a bit emotional, but I will always remember one of my oldest, dearest friends who is sadly no longer with us, and he was receiving treatment for a brain tumour that was already terminal, but they were just trying to prolong his life for a little bit longer. And he had the radio on when we were talking about Extinction Rebellion, and he'd heard or read various blowhards talking about, what about people's hospital appointments? What if they've got this and what if they've got that? And he texted me from the back of a taxi to say, I'm actually on my way to chemo. And I approve of the protest while stuck in traffic in South London but I think he was probably quite a rare character in quite a rare situation, wasn't he?
Yes, yeah, he probably was, and that is really tough treatment because I worked in cancer care, so yeah, that's a hard thing to be going through.
It certainly is.
It probably maybe he just had one of those moments where he thought, well, it's not really going to affect me in the future, but you know what? I can see what they're saying.
It's got young children thinking about the future, paying attention to the issues, instead of accepting the invitation, Kath, to let the red mist fall. And that is such a seductive invitation. How much of the British media in particular, and even politics in general, depends upon offering people an opportunity to be furious without really understanding why. And how different would the world be if they hadn't been allowed so much leeway and freedom, sponsored by the Daily Mail and Rupert Murdoch and all the most powerful people. But hey-ho, it's too late for that. That ship has sailed. Steve is at the Queen Elizabeth Bridge. Steve, what's going on?
Not very much.
Are you on it or up it?
Oh, no, neither. I am beside it.
Right.
And I have been for 3 hours.
Gosh.
Because my car started to break down as I was going through the Dartford Tunnel. So people are using the Dartford Tunnel now instead of the Queen Elizabeth Bridge because it's shut.
Right.
And so there's a huge amount of traffic around each side of the tunnel. So I fought my way through the traffic. My car started to die.
Oh, no.
I managed to just about get through the tunnel, and I pulled into a lay-by, and I'm right next to the road.
Gosh.
Now. So I'm self-employed. I've lost a day's work today. I'm now worrying about the childcare arrangements that I've got in place because I don't know how long I'm going to be here because no recovery companies are coming to pick me up.
To get through.
So, yeah, because they're neither are prepared to come from either side because of the volume of traffic. But the reason I called is that I still support the protesting that has happened because of what it is about, because it is about climate change and so on and so forth. I just feel like that is because it is the most pressing issue.
And I mean,
like this have to happen.
If this was a conversation about vegetarianism, I would now, in the olden days when I was even more of an idiot than I am now, I'd now ask if your shoes were made of leather or if your belt was made of leather, and I'd pretend that was some zinger, some killer point. And I know it's probably necessary for your employment, but you are in a car.
This is the first time in probably 4 years I've taken a car to work. I always get the train.
And you got caught up in there. That'll teach you.
I know, right? That'll learn me. The client that I'm working for today changed the start time.
Right.
I wasn't able to get the train.
Fair enough.
And I've had to get the car. I've had to take my car. It was that or not work.
So you have sought to make changes in your own life in respect of how urgent the crisis is.
Well, look, we're a one-car family, and if I take the car to work, my other half doesn't get to use the car with our son. So, so sometimes there are very limited choices.
Sure. I mean, and you are, I was going to say the Holy Grail, but to be honest, I hadn't even asked you to ring in yet. People actually caught up in it who are still supportive of it. You've come along unprompted and uninvited. Do you must understand the anger of some of the people in a similar situation today?
Definitely. Yeah, of course. Inconvenience is inconvenience, isn't it? It's inconvenient. So by its nature, it's gonna bother people and upset people. And I'm not saying that I don't get inconvenienced and then get wound up.
Sure.
You know, I still hit the steering wheel sometimes if I'm sat in traffic or I'm stamping my foot on the train if there's a delay.
Yes, that's a good point.
You know, that happens, right? But this issue isn't going away. Climate change is not going away, and it is only incrementally being dealt with in the same way that it has been incrementally getting worse, right? So
and governments aren't doing enough. In some cases, they're pressing reverse, and all of the other stuff we talk about every day when it comes to the anonymous interests of extremely vested, extremely wealthy institutions who try and influence the debate. It began with climate change. You can track almost everything awful that's happened to this country in the last 20 years back to climate change and the way that the debates were skewed. You'd get Nigel Lawson turning up to debate with actual scientists about whether or not climate change was real, and it still goes on. You'd have Daily Telegraph columnists writing with no science whatsoever. I mean, it goes on all the time. And so how do you deal with that? If the people that printed the idiots and booked the idiots to appear on programmes from the think tanks and the Telegraph and wherever it may be are the same people now objecting to the protesters, that's almost impossible to believe in the scale of the hypocrisy required. Well, I'll tell you, a few years ago, I was chatting to Nigel Lawson about why climate change is a load of rubbish. Everyone knows it's real now, but these protesters are going about it in the wrong way. And I'll tell you why I know they're getting it wrong, because everyone keeps noticing the protests. Lottie Morley's here with your headlines. 12:34 is the time. The story about China's armed forces recruiting dozens of British ex-military pilots is fascinating, isn't it? James Heapy encouraging them not to sign up. They're perfectly entitled to. There's nothing illegal about it. But, of course, the prospect of them being trained in skills that may one day be used against the West is a very real and present problem. Another illustration, really, that things are often a lot more complicated than tabloid headlines allow. And so it is, I think, with Just Stop Oil protests or even It's not an anti-milk protest. It's an anti-farming, an anti-farming protest, if you like. People emptying bottles of milk all over the supermarket floor. So, oddly, I'm just examining why I've got a bit of a problem with that, and indeed with the pair that threw soup at the sunflowers, albeit that it was covered in perspex and no damage has been done to the canvas. But less of a problem with the Just Stop Oil protesters, who are causing much greater disruption and much greater problems. I guess maybe the court. I genuinely don't know. Andrew's in Harpenden. Andrew, what made you pick up the phone?
Good afternoon,
Hello.
James. Yes, well, I'm laid my cards out. I'm vegan environmentalist for many years, about a decade.
Yes.
Environmentalist, but vegan short period of time. And I guess there are different trigger points for different people.
Yes.
They have different perspectives. And so you have, whether it's the bridge with the sort of people who are driving and disrupted over work, getting to work or or trying to get to nursery or whatever it may be. It's very irritating immediately, and so with regards to meat and dairy, people are inculcated at an early age. With Abbots, most people are. It's a fact.
Yeah.
And it's just habit. How I was when I was growing up, and it's only when I learnt about things differently and I educated myself that I decided to move to plant-based direction.
And what was the trigger for you, if I can put it that way? What was the pivot point for you?
Well, it's actually quite key in this argument about trying to alert people to something, which is what they're doing. As you've said, and other callers have said, if I have some kind of anti-demonstration to whatever it may be in the room I'm in that now. It's not going to, impact anyone unless I'm YouTubing myself and then broadcasting it. So there's that impact, and it's not going to have, you've got to be able to alert people to it. And how do you do that? And they are doing it in a peaceful way.
Yes.
But
very disruptive, I suppose.
Very disruptive.
Peaceful
but
becomes...
then exactly, because there's been so much. I mean, you have animal rebellion. I'm not part of any of these things, but animal and Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, etc. You've had Greenpeace doing it for many decades now.
Yes.
All over the world in all different parts, whether it's in whaling practices or whether it's shell exploration or any other oil explorer. And those oil explorers have known about it. They wrote about how much damage it would be in the late 70s. And so they've actually been cognizant of this for so long.
So how hard would it be then? And this perhaps is something that the protesters could improve on. How hard would it be to somehow create the anger and the frustration, but direct it at the politicians responsible for doing so little or for causing such potential catastrophe? That's the holy grail. I stop the traffic because governments are not doing enough to stop the dependency on fossil fuels. And the people being inconvenienced get angry with the governments who aren't doing enough to stop the dependency on fossil fuels. Is that pie in the sky? Or is that, could we do that?
I never say never.
No?
Just even where I am, the little town that I'm in, it's very, very car-focused and car-centric. And despite where I am, I'm very, very fortunate. I cycle, I take a train, I don't have a car. I'm very fortunate in the location that I'm in and very close to London. And I can just get on Thameslink and I can go into London.
Yeah.
However, a lot of people aren't in that fortunate position.
Exactly.
But, at the same time, you can walk. I can walk downtown. It's not a very big place. Most people in this town can walk, up to a mile, and they can get into the centre of town from wherever they are.
Yes, and I guess that's. If you're doing it in the southeast on a very busy road, then the chances are that a lot of people being inconvenienced could actually have made their journey differently. But if everybody suddenly left their car at home and jumped on the trains would buckle because they're already overcrowded. But you're right. You can't expect everybody to respond to it regardless of context and regardless of their own investment in the relevant issues. I'm cracking on only because there's loads of people waiting to speak. I'm struck by that thought there that the anger goes in the wrong direction from everybody's point of view. The protesters don't want you to be angry with them. They want you to be angry with the governments that are doing nothing. That in some cases are backtracking. Liz Truss, whether or not she U-turns on these plans as well, but she was looking really to backtrack on a lot of environmental promises. is pretty much whatever reason he did it for. The only creditable part of Boris Johnson's political platform was a determination to address some of these issues. So I don't know. I love Andrew's phrase trigger points. They are all different. Why do I feel irritated by people throwing soup at a painting, but not that irritated by people stopping traffic that I could easily be in? Ed's in Hazelmere. Ed, what would you like to say?
Hi. Great to be on. So again, I'm the leader of the Climate Party, and I think you're talking about what's happening with Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and everything else. And you alluded to it just now. It's all about rationality. We get stopped on the street. We're immediately angry that we've been inconvenienced.
Yes.
And then we come up with our reaction afterwards. And our reaction afterwards is either to understand why we've been stopped. We've been stopped because there's a massive problem going on. These people are raising awareness of it, in which case I accept it. Or it's to be angry that I can't get through to my appointment or wherever I happen to be going.
Or a little bit of both. In a way, you're looking for a balance. You'd be 52% irritated but appreciative of the issue and 48% furious because you can't get to work. Then it's a win for the protesters, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And I mean, I've got a sort of personal story of it. I mean, prior to even the Climate Party, I stood as an independent councillor in Buckinghamshire where I'm elected. My only policy was climate action now. I knocked 1,000 doors in Hazelmere, which is a very comfortable, middle-class, generally conservative voting area, and talking about climate, because that was my only policy, and regularly, at least 1 out of 3 people would lead with, I dislike, I'm annoyed by, or I hate XR.
Yeah.
And then they would continue to talk to me for 10 or 15 minutes about their angst on climate change, how they're worried that nothing's being done, how they're deploring the fact that the council doesn't do anything at a higher level, how in our little local area in the parish, how they're proud that the parish has set a 2030 target,
right,
is trying to do things. And by the fact that the local council is doing something, they felt agency.
Yes.
They could join in with activities and move forward. But often the conversation came out of an initial complaint about XR. I hate them because of what they're doing.
Yes.
That is over the top. I don't agree with it.
Gosh.
But then they led on. Their awareness was raised, and they led on and then went into the conversation.
Could you have one without the other? Would you have the increases in awareness without the big ticket protests that really focus attention and draw attention and do disrupt?
I think currently it is impossible that we would have a raising of awareness if we hadn't had protests.
I do too.
Whether these are the right kind of protests is a completely different issue.
That's the crucial question. But in order to get noticed, they have to be disruptive, don't they?
You have to be disruptive, even if in a political sense. I mean, look at protests from a political sense and look historically. Political protest has been disruptive. That doesn't mean it's always been breaking the law or anything else like that, but it's always been disruptive to catch the attention. You're absolutely right. I mean, it may not be for you and I go and sit on a street and or lock ourselves, put a chain around our neck against a railing or scale up, onto a bridge. But we should be out doing something else. And whether that's joining, a climate strike in the street, whether it is writing to the councillors and MPs to get more action, whether it's joining the right party that's making the right noises, whether it's voting for the right one at the next election. They're all forms of action that we need to take. And we don't all want to do all of them.
Do you know, as you speak, Ed, there's footage on the screen, and it's old footage, I think it's from yesterday, of a protester, I think at the Chinese embassy in London, getting his head kicked in by guards at the embassy. And in many ways, that seemed quite a pertinent thing to pop up on the television, because there's a protester protesting against something that most people can happily agree is egregious and needs to be protested against, but the principles are the same. It's the difference between what protests are acceptable, what authorities should be able to do in order to close them down, how much support you enjoy, and I do fear with some of the protests on the roads that we are days away from seeing some self-appointed vigilante take it upon himself to put, it was at the consulate in Manchester, I beg your pardon, not the embassy in London, take it upon themselves to mete out some summary justice. I've looked you up because I wasn't familiar previously with, now that I've read it, I was familiar with the Climate Party, but I'm interested in your personal story because you're described usually as a former army officer and city lawyer, so not necessarily the most obvious advocate of the sort of policies you are supporting and promoting. What happened to you? Did you have a moment? Did you have a Damascene moment or a pivotal moment? What made you so committed and so passionate?
Well, remarkably, I did. Not that would have stopped me doing the action once I'd understood the science. But yes, in June 2019, having started on the 3rd of June World No Disposable Cup Day, about 3 weeks later on, I'd become a bit of a sponge for climate information. I had a dream. So, my kids, I'm a single father for more than 10 years now, bringing up 2 young boys. At the time, they were 10 and 12. And in my dream, they're 30 years of age. And they're returning back to my semi-detached house in Hazelmere, knocking on the door, and they're in their full army kit. They've khakis, they've got berets on, they've got their green army bags hung over their shoulders. And they come in together and they dump their army bags into the hall. They come into the living room, and I'm sitting there having a coffee. And they come up to me and say, Papa, we've just come back from Europe where we are shooting people to stop them getting the drinking water.
Gosh.
And they look at me and they go, we're being shot at and we could be killed, but we've got great equipment, black jackets and big guns, and we're shooting the poor people who have smaller guns to stop them getting the drinking water. And then they go on and they say, and that's so that you and other people in Britain can continue to live in the luxury you've lived in for the previous decades. And they say to me then, they say, look, you knew about this, Papa, didn't you, 20 years ago? And the reason I say Papa, in case anyone was commenting, is because we lived abroad for a while. And they say, you knew about this 20 years ago, Papa, and what did you do?
Gosh.
And I then woke up and I had a slight tear coming down the side of my face. And I was mouthing words. I wasn't speaking them. And I was mouthing, but I've got to look after you.
Yeah.
But I've got a job. But I've got a mortgage. And I turned around, I put my feet on the ground. I went, that's just not good enough. And I just decided I would give up on everything in order to solve the climate crisis.
Dedicate yourself to this, a pioneer.
And I just got on it.
An outrider, and obviously the success depends entirely upon how many people follow. Thank you, Ed. I found that very moving, and I mean inspiring up to a point, by which I simply mean not as transformative as your dream was, and that's what I mean by guilt. Because listening to that, however hard you're trying to persuade yourself that Ed's a bit of a hippie or a silly old, he's right. Especially the bit about I've got to look after you, I've got a mortgage, I've got a job, I've got stuff that I've got to do. So either you sit with your guilt or you pretend that he's your enemy. I would suggest, or you join him. You give everything else up and commit yourself to this cause. That is, of the three, by far the hardest thing to do. For most of us, the choice now is to sit with your guilt and try to be better, or to pretend that he's your enemy. And of course, all of the people that encouraged you to support Brexit or encouraged you to support trickle-down economics or to support Boris Johnson or to support anything that was actually against your own interests, but in the interests of the kind of people that make a ton of money from fossil fuels every year, or your Rupert Murdoch columnists and your Daily Telegraph climate change deniers, they will all be encouraging you to think that Ed is your enemy. He didn't sound like your enemy, did he? He sounded like someone who cares about your children as much as he cares about his own. So if you can't join him, and I can't yet, then why not, instead of accepting the invitation to hate him or to think that he's your enemy or that he's a virtue-signalling do-gooder who's probably a member of the anti-growth coalition, why don't you just try sitting with your guilt and trying to be better? It's not that hard. It is 12:52 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We will talk about this again if we don't have time to take any more calls today on this question of throwing soup at paintings and climbing up bridges and gluing yourself to roads and emptying milk bottles in supermarkets, because there's only 6 minutes of the programme left and Theo Usherwood is here, and people have been telling me a lot lately how much they enjoy Theo Usherwood's contributions to the programme. Oh, that's good. Can I tell you something silly?
Go on.
I mean, you're more of an anorak than I. Well, probably equal anoraks. Just apply slightly different trades. I cannot wait for PMQs tomorrow.
I can't. Honestly, I'm so excited about it.
It's ridiculous.
Can we do a special setup?
I don't know if we
We need to come in with like those big drinks that you get at the cinema, popcorn, the pick and mix.
Like at the baseball, have someone wandering through with hot dogs. I cannot. I mean, it's going
to be so exciting.
Except it isn't, because the more excited you get about something like this, and the more you big it up, the more of an anticlimax it is.
No.
But how is Liz Truss going to?
But it's so important, and the reason it's so important, we can get excited about it and talk about it. The reason it's so important is just watch for the reaction of the Conservative backbenchers, because I'll come on to Theresa May, she's in my mind on something else, but if Liz Truss fluffs it up, then you've got the meeting of the 1922 Executive Committee on tomorrow afternoon, right, and they can simply change the rules to get rid of her almost immediately. And that's the crucial dynamic to this, is that at the moment Liz Truss almost has a reprieve for the next 24 hours. Tory MPs I've been speaking to are trying to come up with a unity candidate. They can't do it at the moment. The pressure's mounting on Rishi Sunak to concede that he can't be Prime Minister because Boris Johnson's supporters won't allow for Rishi Sunak to govern. And the point that's being made to me is that actually whoever takes over is going to have to command a majority in the House of Commons, because they've got 2 years to actually get some really important governing done if they're to stand any chance at the next election. And Boris Johnson, of course, can't become Prime Minister because Rishi Sunak supporters won't wear it.
And also because he might well be sort of effectively slung out by the Privileges Committee.
Yes.
Also, he's moved on to the next grift now. He wants to make money.
Do you know who they're talking about now?
Well, obviously I do now, because you've blown it by saying Theresa May by accident 2 minutes ago.
Theresa May. So this is what...
As a sort of safe... The reason she got the job in the first place, a safe pair of hands candidate who might be able to steer them through these incredibly internecine warfare.
She's competent, she's boring, she'll calm things down. That's what I was told a short while ago when I was walking around Westminster, and seen as a safe pair of hands. What's going against Theresa May...
And this is hang on a minute. I mean, just pause for a minute to think about that. I mean, at some point, somebody is going to have to stand up and say, we cannot move on until we recognise the ridiculousness of leaving the European Union.
But that's the point that somebody who was in touch with me, who knows Theresa May well, was making, that actually until the Northern Ireland Protocol is sorted, that Theresa May can't take over, because the European Research Group, remember Mark Francois, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Brexit years, 2018-19.
The ones who are more responsible for the current chaos than anybody else in the country.
They won't allow it. So where do you go from there?
Because they still think they're right.
And then there's talk about Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor. Now, of course, if October the 3rd, let's say Liz Truss manages to get through tomorrow, Jeremy Hunt manages to stabilise things and the markets calm down, Liz Truss manages, and when it comes to the OBR's report on October the 31st, actually that passes off without major incident, then you could end up in a situation where
it probably is going to pass off without major incident, because they've undone all of the things that the OBR would have been very, very critical of and worried about. So apart from the national insurance cut, or the absence of the rise, there's not a lot there to scare the horses. But I mean, it's happening a lot at the moment. I'm getting towards the end of the programme and I'm shattered, because the intellectual energy you need to engage with this level of... Because normally you can do some of it on autopilot. I'm not suggesting that we do that a lot.
No.
But, PMQs, for example, it would not be beyond the realms of possibility that if somebody went through the archives, there'd be 2 episodes of PMQs 2 years apart where you and I had said more or less the same things to each other.
Yeah, that's very true.
That's not going to happen tomorrow.
No, tomorrow is huge. As somebody on the 1922 committee put it, it's from Liz Truss's point of view, it's vital that she puts in a good performance.
But how can she put in a good performance?
But bringing the other dynamic to this, James, bringing the other dynamic to this is, what does Keir Starmer do? Yeah. Does Keir Starmer want to have the worst PMQs possible? Because as one senior Labour politician put it to me, they're desperate to keep Liz Truss in post. So does he just do underarm throws, goes in really soft, makes Liz Truss look really competent and good, doesn't bring up any of the contradictions from last week where Liz Truss criticised Labour's policy for only having the money in place for the energy price guarantee up until April, and now that's the government's policy. What does Keir Starmer do? Does he actually need to really soft pedal tomorrow to make sure that Liz Truss stays in post? Because as it was put to me, Liz Truss is Labour's biggest asset.
Yeah, but it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, doing that, second-guessing that, it's a bit like... I don't know if this quite works, but you're trying to game it, aren't you?
Yeah,
which is always risky.
And a Labour MP put it to me when I was saying, putting this idea forward that's been talked to me by others, he was saying, actually, what matters for my constituents in the north of England it's their lives, it's their mortgage payments, it's their energy bills. Exactly. We don't want to be seen to be playing politics. We don't want to be seen to be gaming it.
No one's going to think that until you tell them. No one's going to actually watch Keir Starmer tomorrow and think, I think he's deliberately gone easy on her. He's more likely to get criticism for not. They're just going to think he's not up to the job of going in hard on her, and he's gone in soft on her because that's what he does. But anyway, what time should we start the talk? 11:45 tomorrow? 11:45. Yeah, you busy? Check your diary. You're really excited. I'm really excited about this. It is one for the ages. It's like a sort of Real Madrid, Barcelona. Well, except it's not.
It can't disappoint. We can't get to 12:45 or 12:30.
You said that. We've said that before.
We have.
In fact, the more we big it up, historically, the bigger the.
It's going to be terrible. It's going to be boring.
The damper the squib. Sheila Fogarty is here now.
You see, I don't feel the same way as you about tomorrow.
Do you not?
I think it's a disgrace and we should all be horrified it's happening at all.
It's all of that as well. It's not either or, Sheila.
Sorry, have I just been mum?
Yes, you have a bit.
Right, tidy up.
I've done 3 hours of disgrace.
Tidy your bedroom.
I'm just having 30 seconds of anticipation.
Well, if yesterday was say a little prayer, today is I just don't know what to do with myself. Oh, 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 what to do with myself.